The Biker Gang vs. The Resilient Leader, A Night to Remember. Part 1. The Calm Before the Storm. It was a quiet night at a small-town bar known as The Groove. The dim neon lights cast soft shadows across the parking lot, where only a few cars were parked. Inside, the air was calm and filled with the sound of light chatter. At the bar sat the town's local hero, a man who carried himself with calm confidence. Chris Parker, a renowned performer and an influential community leader, was unwinding after a long, high-energy performance. His signature relaxed style and sharp wit had made him a beloved figure not only in the music world but also within his community. "Man, you should call it a night," said his close friend and DJ, Tony Dre, sliding onto the stool beside him. "That show tonight was wild. You need to rest." Chris took a sip of his iced tea, the cold glass soothing his tired hands. "Just give me a minute. I need to let my mind cool down," he replied with a small smile. The bar wasn't crowded, just a handful of late-night workers and a young bartender named Vanessa, who left her corporate career behind to live a quieter life. She moved gracefully between tables, her warmth making everyone feel at ease. "Man, that bass line you dropped was insane tonight," Tony added, leaning closer. "You brought the house down." Chris chuckled softly. "It wasn't just me. We all played our part." He glanced around the bar, noticing how peaceful everything seemed in the moment, a sharp contrast to the chaos that would soon walk through the door. Suddenly, the peace was interrupted by the deep, rumbling sound of motorcycles approaching in the distance. The growl grew louder, echoing off the nearby buildings until 6 motorcycles pulled into the parking lot. Their chrome bodies gleamed under the neon glow as the riders, clad in leather vests with a snarling wolf logo, dismounted with intimidating ease. Vanessa froze mid-pour as one of the bikers walked through the door, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. The man's grizzled face and sharp eyes demanded attention, his vest bearing the name Wolf, president of the Steel Wolves MC. Behind him followed his enforcer, a hulking man known as Tank, and 4 other gang members who carried an air of unchecked violence. Chris didn't turn around, but his posture shifted ever so slightly. Years of being in the public eye had taught him how to read a room, and this room had just turned dangerous. Well, Wolf's gravelly voice echoed across the bar. "Looks like we found ourselves a cozy little spot for the night." As the bikers spread out, claiming the space as their own, the once peaceful bar grew tense. Vanessa hesitated before asking, "Can I get you gentlemen anything?" Wolf leaned against the counter, his smile cold and predatory. "Sure, sweetheart. How about you start by telling me what a pretty girl like you is doing in a place like this?" Vanessa took a small step back, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm just doing my job." "That's too bad," Snake, one of the bikers, sneered. "With looks like that, you should be doing something a little more exciting." At a corner booth, an elderly couple nervously gathered their things, trying to slip out unnoticed. But Ghost, the gang's quietest yet most menacing member, stepped in their path. "Leaving already?" he asked, his voice low and threatening. It was then that Chris finally spoke, his calm but firm words cutting through the rising tension. "Let them go." The entire bar turned toward him, and for the first time, Wolf noticed the man who dared to challenge him. Wolf approached Chris with slow, measured steps. "What was that, buddy?" Chris turned to face him, meeting his gaze with unshaken confidence. "I said let them go. They're just trying to enjoy their evening in peace." Part 2. A Brewing Storm. Wolf's smirk widened as he leaned against the bar, towering over Chris. "Looks like we've got ourselves a hero tonight, boys. You know what happens to people who don't mind their business in this town." Chris didn't flinch. He set his glass of iced tea down and replied, "I've been in enough places to know that people who hide behind fear usually fall the hardest." The room grew silent. Tank, the massive enforcer, stepped closer, his fists tightening. "Boss, I can deal with this guy right now," he growled, cracking his knuckles. Wolf raised a hand to stop him, keeping his eyes locked on Chris. "Easy to. Let's give the man a chance to explain why he thinks he's so brave." He leaned in closer, his cold eyes scanning Chris as if sizing him up. "You're not from around here, are you? So, why don't you sit down, keep sipping that little drink of yours, and let the grown-ups handle things. Officer Thompson. Chris tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor unwavering. I've been in rooms louder and more chaotic than this. And I've stood in front of crowds that would make you disappear into the shadows. So, here's the deal, leave these people alone, or you'll find out what real leadership looks like. Tank let out a deep laugh and stepped forward. This guy thinks he's a leader, boss. Maybe we should show him what happens to loudmouths in Steel Wolves territory. Chris stood up from his seat. While he wasn't as physically imposing as Tank, his presence carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. He adjusted his jacket and faced the gang directly. Territory? This isn't a battlefield. It's a place where people come to relax and connect after long days. If you think you can turn this into your playground, you've got another thing coming. Wolf narrowed his eyes, sensing that Chris wasn't an ordinary man. There was a sharpness in his voice, a confidence that made the gang leader hesitate, if only for a moment. But his pride wouldn't let him back down in front of his crew. You talk big for a man standing alone, Wolf sneered. Let's see if you can back it up. Before anyone could react, Tank lunged forward, his massive hand reaching out to grab Chris. But Chris moved with precision. He sidestepped the attack, using Tank's momentum against him. In one swift motion, Chris delivered a sharp strike to Tank's forearm, targeting a nerve point that made the enforcer wince in pain and stumble back. The bar erupted in chaos. Glasses shattered, chairs scraped across the floor, and patrons scrambled to the sides. Joe, the bar's owner, reached for the phone to call the police, but Wolf's sharp voice stopped him. Don't even think about it, old man. Vanessa, clutching a bottle behind the counter, looked to Chris, her eyes filled with worry. Chris, they're dangerous. Please, just leave before this gets worse. Chris glanced at her, his voice calm and steady. Don't worry, Vanessa. They're just making noise. That's what bullies do. Tank, now furious, charged at Chris again. This time, Chris ducked under the swing of his massive fist, delivering a calculated elbow strike to Tank's ribs. The big man let out a grunt of pain as he staggered, clutching his side. Wolf's smirk faded as he watched his enforcer falter. Enough, he barked, pulling a knife from his belt. The blade glinted under the dim bar lights. You've had your fun, hero. But now, I'm going to teach you a lesson you'll never forget. Chris stood his ground, his posture relaxed but ready. You're not the first person to threaten me, Wolf. And you definitely won't be the last. But let me ask you something, how's this working out for you so far? The gang leader's hand tightened around the knife. He took a step closer, but before he could act, the sound of distant sirens filled the air. Everyone froze as the red and blue lights of a patrol car flashed through the bar's front windows. Wolf glared at Chris, his face twisting with anger. You called the cops? He spat. Chris shook his head. No need. Officer Thompson usually checks on this place around this time. I guess your timing's just a little off. The bar door swung open, and Officer Mike Thompson stepped inside, his hand resting casually on his holstered weapon. His sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in the scene. Evening, folks. Everything all right here? Wolf cursed under his breath, sheathing his knife. He gestured to his crew. We were just leaving. The gang began filing out, their earlier bravado replaced by frustration and quiet fury. As Wolf passed Chris, he leaned in close and whispered, This isn't over. Chris met his gaze with calm confidence. You're right, it's not. But next time, think carefully about who you're trying to intimidate. Part 3. The Warning. As the Steel Wolves rode off into the night, the tension in the bar began to ease. The soft hum of conversations slowly returned as the patrons emerged from their hiding spots. Officer Thompson, still scanning the room for any signs of lingering danger, approached Chris. Care to tell me what happened here? Thompson asked, his tone calm but firm. Chris leaned against the bar, picking up his glass of iced tea. Just a group of guys trying to flex their muscles. They didn't like hearing no. Vanessa came over, her hands still trembling slightly as she placed a fresh glass of tea in front of Chris. He handled them, she said, her voice filled with awe. I've never seen anything like it. Unraised an eyebrow. Handled them, huh? Well, I've been trying to build a case against the Steel Wolves for months, but they're slippery. They intimidate witnesses, and no one wants to talk. Chris nodded, his expression serious. I've seen their type before. They thrive on fear. Take that away, and they don't have much left. Joe, the bar owner, joined the conversation. His face was lined with years of hard work, but tonight it carried a mix of gratitude and concern. Chris, you stood up to them tonight, but they'll be back. Wolf doesn't take embarrassment lightly. Chris's gaze shifted toward the window, where the faint glow of motorcycle taillights still lingered in the distance. I know, he said quietly, but people like him need to be shown that fear isn't the answer. They need to see what real strength looks like. Thompson sighed. I admire your courage, but Wolf isn't just a guy with a gang. He's got connections. Other chapters, bigger groups. If you keep standing in his way, he's going to come after you, and it won't be with just 6 guys next time. Chris looked the officer in the eye. Then I'll be ready. Later that night, Chris sat in his apartment, staring out the window at the quiet street below. His mind was racing, replaying the events of the evening. He knew Wolf wasn't finished, and the next encounter wouldn't be so simple. The Steel Wolves would come back, and they'd come back harder. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from an unknown number. You think you're a hero, don't you? This isn't over. Watch your back. Chris stared at the message for a moment before deleting it. He leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing on his lips. Threats like that didn't scare him, they only strengthened his resolve. The next day, the sun had barely risen when the first reports came in. Joe called Chris early in the morning, his voice shaking. They hit 3 other bars last night, he said. Smashed windows, slashed tires, left their mark everywhere. And they're asking about you? Chris listened silently, his jaw tightening. What else? They spray-painted the front of my bar, Joe continued. Left a message, this isn't over. Chris hung up and headed straight to Snoop's Groove. When he arrived, he found Joe scrubbing red spray paint off the building's facade. Vanessa was inside, organizing supplies and nervously glancing at the door every few minutes. You didn't have to come back, Joe said as Chris approached. You've already done enough. Chris picked up a sponge and started helping with the cleanup. If I walk away now, they win. Joe gave him a tired smile. You've got guts, kid. I'll give you that. As they worked, the familiar roar of motorcycles echoed in the distance. Chris glanced toward the street, his senses heightened. A group of bikers cruised by slowly, their eyes locked on the bar as they passed. It was a warning, a reminder that the Steel Wolves were watching. That evening, Chris returned to the bar as the sun dipped below the horizon. The regulars were quieter than usual, their laughter replaced with nervous whispers. Vanessa approached him, holding a cup of tea. Are you sure about this? She asked. They're going to come back. You know that, right? Chris took the cup, nodding. I know. But they need to see that we're not afraid. Vanessa hesitated, then placed a hand on his arm. You're not just standing up for yourself, you know. You're standing up for all of us. Chris smiled at her. Then we'll do it together. As the night wore on, Chris prepared himself for what was coming. He didn't know when or how the Steel Wolves would strike again, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't back down. Part 4. The Return of the Steel Wolves. The clock ticked past midnight, and the tension in Snoop's Groove bar was palpable. Chris sat in his usual spot, his demeanor calm but his mind sharp, every muscle in his body ready for what he knew was coming. Joe stood behind the bar, polishing glasses with deliberate slowness, his eyes darting toward the entrance every few seconds. Vanessa moved quietly among the remaining patrons, her nerves barely concealed beneath her professional facade. Then it began. The low rumble of motorcycles echoed through the night, growing louder and louder until it became a deafening roar. The patrons froze, their conversations falling silent as the sound of engines surrounded the bar. Lights from the parking lot flooded through the windows, casting long shadows on the walls. Joe's hand instinctively moved toward the bat he kept under the counter. Vanessa, standing by the far end of the bar, glanced nervously at Chris, who hadn't moved. He calmly set his glass down and stood, his eyes fixed on the door. The sound of boots hitting the pavement signaled their arrival. The door creaked open, and in walked Wolf, flanked by Tank and Snake, with several more members of the Steel Wolves trailing behind. This time, their numbers had doubled. Wolf's cold eyes scanned the room, his lips curling into a predatory smirk. Well, he said, his voice dripping with malice. Look who's still here. Chris stepped forward, meeting Wolf's gaze with unwavering confidence. I told you, he said evenly. You don't scare me. Wolf chuckled darkly, his hand resting on the chain hanging from his belt. Brave words, Rapper. But bravery only gets you so far. Tank stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. Let's see if you're still brave after tonight. The showdown. Before Wolf could give the order, the bar door swung open again. Officer Thompson entered, flanked by 2 other officers, their hands resting casually on their holstered weapons. Evening, gentlemen, Thompson said, his voice calm but authoritative. What brings the Steel Wolves out this late? Wolf's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. Just stopping by for a drink, he said, his tone mocking. Is that a crime? Thompson's eyes narrowed. Depends on what you do after that drink. Chris stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. You don't belong here, Wolf, he said. This isn't your town, and these aren't your people. Wolf's face darkened. You think you can take me on? You think a couple of cops are going to stop us? Chris smiled faintly. Oh. But the entire town might. At that moment, headlights flicked on outside. Cars began pulling into the parking lot, one after another, until it was filled with vehicles. Studio crew members, local business owners, bar patrons, and even families stepped out, forming a united front against the Steel Wolves. Wolf's crew exchanged uneasy glances as the sheer number of people became apparent. The once confident bikers now looked cornered, their intimidation tactics losing their edge. This is what happens when a community stands together, Chris said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Your fear doesn't work here anymore. The final confrontation. Wolf's pride wouldn't allow him to back down. He pulled the chain from his belt, swinging it menacingly. You think you've won? This isn't over. Chris stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. It's over, Wolf. Walk away now while you still can. Wolf lunged, but Chris was ready. With a swift, practiced movement, he sidestepped the attack, grabbing Wolf's wrist and twisting it in a way that forced him to drop the chain. Wolf stumbled back, clutching his hand in pain. Tank and Snake rushed forward, but Chris met them head-on. Years of discipline and experience guided his movements as he used their aggression against them, dodging their blows and delivering precise strikes that left them staggering. The other bikers hesitated, their confidence shaken. Officer Thompson and his team stepped in, their weapons drawn. That's enough. Thompson barked. Everyone stand down. Realizing they were outnumbered and outmatched, the remaining Steel Wolves began retreating. Wolf, still nursing his injured wrist, glared at Chris with pure hatred. This isn't the end, he spat. You'll regret this. Chris held his ground, his gaze steady. No, Wolf. You're the one who's going to regret it. The community united. As the Steel Wolves fled into the night, the bar erupted in cheers. Joe set down his bat, shaking his head in amazement. I've been running this place for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like that. Vanessa approached Chris, her eyes filled with admiration. You did it, she said softly. You stood up to them. Chris smiled. We all did. Officer Thompson clapped him on the shoulder. You've got guts, kid. I'll give you that. But you've also made some powerful enemies. Chris nodded. Let them come. We'll be ready. Outside, the gathered crowd began to disperse, their spirits lifted by the night's victory. Chris stood in the doorway, watching them go, a sense of pride and determination washing over him. This wasn't just a win for him, it was a win for the entire community. To be continued. The Steel Wolves may have been defeated for now, but their shadow still loomed. Chris knew the fight wasn't over, but he also knew he wasn't alone. Together, they would face whatever came next, proving that courage and unity could overcome even the darkest threats. You said, continue. ChatGPT said. ChatGPT. Part 5. The Ripple Effect. The night at Snoop's Groove Bar ended on a high note, but Chris knew it was just the beginning. The Steel Wolves weren't just another gang. They were part of a larger network with deeper roots and connections. For every small victory, the stakes grew higher. The next morning, Chris walked into his recording studio. The atmosphere was buzzing with tension and excitement. Dwayne, his manager, approached him, holding a tablet loaded with social media feeds and news updates. "You've gone viral again," Dwayne said, showing Chris the trending hashtags, hashtag #SteelWolves defeated, hashtag community unity, and hashtag Chris stands tall. Clips of last night's confrontation at the bar had been shared across every platform, with people applauding Chris's bravery and the community's solidarity. Chris set the tablet down. "This is bigger than me, Dwayne. People are standing up all over. It's not just about this town anymore." Dwayne nodded, but his face was lined with concern. "That's true, but the wolves won't let this slide. We've been getting calls, anonymous threats, cryptic warnings. They're regrouping." Vanessa entered, holding a folder. "I've been tracking reports from nearby towns. It's worse than we thought. Chapters from other gangs are starting to mobilize. They're treating this as a challenge to their entire way of operating." Chris leaned against the table, his eyes narrowing. "Good. If they want to play this game, we'll show them they can't win by fear anymore." A new challenge. Later that day, Officer Thompson arrived at the studio with a serious look on his face. He carried a folder filled with intelligence reports and photographs. "Chris, we need to talk." He spread the documents across the table. They showed images of gang meetings, maps with marked territories, and a list of known leaders, including Reaper, the regional head of the Steel Wolves. "Reaper's not like Wolf," Thompson explained. "He's smarter, more organized. And he's furious about what happened last night. He's calling in reinforcements from all over the region." Chris studied the photos, his mind working quickly. "What's his endgame?" "Control," Thompson said. "He wants to crush anyone who challenges him. And after last night, you're at the top of his list." Dwayne crossed his arms. "So what do we do? Wait for them to come to us?" Chris shook his head. "No. We take the fight to them. But not with violence. We'll use the same tools we've always used: music, influence, and community." Vanessa looked skeptical. "Chris, they're not going to back down just because we throw a concert." "They won't," Chris agreed. "But we're not just throwing a concert. We're organizing the community. We'll show them what happens when people come together. They can't intimidate an entire town united." The call to action. Chris spent the next few days planning a massive event, a free concert in the heart of the city. The event would bring people together, not just for music but to stand as a united front against fear and intimidation. Local businesses offered to sponsor the event, and volunteers flooded in to help organize it. The hashtag #StandStrong began trending as word spread. News outlets picked up the story, and the event gained national attention. Celebrities and influencers voiced their support, turning the concert into a symbol of resistance against oppression. As the day of the event approached, tensions grew. Reports of biker activity increased, with sightings of Steel Wolves and their allies in neighboring towns. Officer Thompson doubled patrols, and plainclothes officers mingled with the crowd to ensure safety. The night of the concert. The city's main square was transformed into a vibrant venue, with a massive stage set against the skyline. Thousands of people filled the streets, holding signs with messages of hope and solidarity. Families, students, and workers stood shoulder to shoulder, their presence a powerful statement against fear. Chris stood backstage, his heart pounding. Dwayne approached him, handing him a microphone. "You ready?" Chris nodded. "Always." The lights dimmed, and the crowd erupted in cheers as Chris stepped onto the stage. He stood in silence for a moment, taking in the sea of faces before him. Then he began to speak. "Fear thrives in silence," he said, his voice steady and clear. "But tonight, we're breaking that silence. We're showing the world that courage is louder than fear." The crowd roared in response. Chris continued, his words flowing with passion. He spoke about unity, resilience, and the power of standing together. He called out the Steel Wolves by name, challenging them not with violence but with the strength of a united community. Then, the music began. The confrontation. As Chris performed, the roar of motorcycles echoed in the distance. The crowd tensed, their eyes scanning the horizon. The Steel Wolves arrived, led by Reaper himself. They parked their bikes at the edge of the square, their presence a clear challenge. Chris noticed them but didn't falter. He continued to sing, his voice rising above the noise. The crowd, emboldened by his presence, began to chant, "Stand strong! Stand strong!" Reaper dismounted his bike and approached the stage, his men following close behind. Officer Thompson and his team intercepted them, creating a barrier between the bikers and the crowd. Reaper smirked, his eyes locked on Chris. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't save you." Chris stepped down from the stage, his microphone still in hand. He walked toward Reaper, stopping just short of the police line. "You don't scare me," Chris said, his voice amplified for everyone to hear. "And you don't scare them?" Reaper's smirk faltered as he glanced at the crowd. The sheer number of people, families, children, workers, was overwhelming. His men shifted uneasily, their confidence shaken. "This is your last chance," Chris said. "Walk away. Leave this town and don't come back. Because if you try to take us down, you'll be facing all of us." Reaper stared at Chris for a long moment, the tension thick in the air. Then, with a curt nod, he turned to his men. "Let's go." The steel wolves mounted their bikes and roared away, their departure met with deafening cheers from the crowd. The aftermath. The concert ended with a sense of triumph and unity. Chris stood on the stage one last time, looking out at the smiling faces of the crowd. He knew the fight wasn't over, but tonight had been a victory, a reminder that courage and community could overcome even the darkest challenges. As the crowd dispersed, Officer Thompson approached Chris. "You did good, Chris. Real good. But don't let your guard down. Reaper's not the kind of man to give up easily." Chris nodded, his resolve unshaken. "Let him come. We'll be ready." The night had proven one thing: fear might cast long shadows, but when people stood together, even the darkest shadows couldn't block out the light. Part 6. A Quiet Resilience. The concert became a defining moment for the town, a rallying cry that reverberated far beyond its borders. Social media exploded with videos and photos of the event, painting Chris as a modern-day hero who used his voice not just for music but for justice. News outlets ran stories about the Steel Wolves' retreat, highlighting the community's courage and Chris's unshakable leadership. But while the town celebrated, Chris knew better than to assume the battle was over. The warning. 2 nights after the concert, Chris received an unexpected visitor at his studio. Officer Thompson walked in with a grim expression, carrying a folder under his arm. "We've intercepted chatter," Thompson said, setting the folder on the table. "Reaper's regrouping. He's called in reinforcements from other chapters and even reached out to rival gangs. He's desperate to save face." Chris leaned over the table, flipping through the photographs and transcripts. The images showed meetings in dimly lit warehouses, bikers with tattoos that marked their allegiance, and maps of the region with circles drawn around key locations. "What's his plan?" Chris asked. "Reaper's smart," Thompson admitted. "He knows a direct confrontation won't work. He'll try to dismantle your support, target the people closest to you, make them afraid to stand by you." Chris clenched his fists. "He's going after the community." Thompson nodded. "Exactly. He's betting that if he can break their spirit, he'll break yours too." The strategy. Chris called a meeting with his closest allies, Vanessa, Dwayne, and Joe. They gathered in the studio's conference room, the weight of the situation clear on everyone's faces. "We can't let him intimidate us," Chris said. "If we back down now, everything we've built will fall apart." Vanessa, still sporting a faint bruise from her encounter with the wolves, nodded. "What do you have in mind?" "We go on the offensive," Chris replied. "Not with violence, but with visibility. We'll launch a campaign, rallies, public events, workshops. We'll flood the streets with positivity and community strength." Dwayne frowned. "That's risky, Chris. The more visible we are, the more vulnerable we become." Chris met his gaze. "Exactly. We show them we're not afraid. We show them that no matter what they do, we won't be silenced." The campaign begins. Over the next week, the town came alive with activity. Chris and his team organized events at schools, community centers, and parks. They held workshops on self-defense, seminars on standing up to bullies, and concerts that doubled as fundraisers for local charities. The hashtag Fearless Together began trending as people from neighboring towns joined the movement. Stories of resilience and defiance flooded social media, with communities across the region standing up to intimidation and fear. The Steel Wolves tried to push back. They vandalized buildings, slashed tires, and sent threatening messages. But every act of aggression was met with an even stronger show of unity. The community refused to be broken. The final confrontation. Late one night, Chris received a call from Thompson. "We've got a tip," the officer said. "Reaper and his men are meeting at an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. This might be your chance to end this." Chris's first instinct was to go alone, but Dwayne, Vanessa, and Joe insisted on coming with him. "This isn't just your fight, Chris," Vanessa said. "We're in this together." When they arrived at the warehouse, they found Thompson and his team already in position. The police had surrounded the building, but they were waiting for Chris to decide how to proceed. Chris took a deep breath and stepped forward, his friends close behind. The warehouse door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing Reaper and a dozen of his men gathered around a table. Reaper looked up, his expression a mix of surprise and disdain. "You've got guts, Chris. I'll give you that." Chris didn't hesitate. "This ends tonight, Reaper. No more threats, no more violence. You're done." Reaper laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think you can just walk in here and tell me what to do? You've got no idea who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Chris said, his voice steady. "A man who's so afraid of losing control that he's willing to destroy everything around him just to hold on to it. But fear doesn't work here anymore. Not on me, not on this town." The room fell silent as Chris's words sank in. Even Reaper's men seemed uncertain, their confidence wavering in the face of Chris's calm authority. Reaper's smirk faded. "You think you've won, don't you?" Chris stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "I don't need to win, Reaper. I just need you to realize you've already lost. The people aren't afraid of you anymore. They're standing together, and there's nothing you can do to stop that." The turning point. Before Reaper could respond, the warehouse doors burst open, and Thompson's team moved in. The bikers froze, their bravado evaporating as they realized they were surrounded. Reaper glared at Chris, his fists clenched. "This isn't over." Chris met his gaze with quiet determination. "It is for you." As the police began making arrests, Chris turned to leave. His friends followed him outside, where the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. The aftermath. With Reaper and his men behind bars, the Steel Wolves' hold on the region crumbled. Communities that had once lived in fear began to rebuild, their confidence restored by Chris's leadership and the town's unity. The events of the past weeks changed Chris forever. He had always believed in the power of music to inspire and unite, but now he had seen firsthand how much more it could do. It wasn't just about the songs, it was about the message, the strength, and the courage to stand up for what was right. As he walked back into his studio that morning, Chris knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be challenges, always be those who tried to rule by fear. But now he also knew this. When people stood together, they could face anything. And in the end, that was all the power he needed. Part 7. The Ripple Effect. News of Reaper's arrest and the Steel Wolves' downfall spread like wildfire. The town that had once been overshadowed by fear was now a symbol of resilience and unity. National news outlets began picking up the story, dubbing Chris as the voice of courage. Interviews, talk shows, and social media platforms became a platform for Chris to share his message of empowerment. The community rebuilds. The following weeks were transformative for the town. Local businesses that had been terrorized by the Steel Wolves started thriving again. Families that had stayed indoors now roamed the streets freely. Chris and his team worked tirelessly to ensure the momentum wasn't lost. Vanessa, who had been deeply moved by the events, spearheaded a new initiative, the Fearless Fund, a non-profit organization aimed at supporting victims of gang violence and helping communities rebuild. The fund gained instant traction, with donations pouring in from across the country. Celebrities, activists, and everyday people contributed, inspired by the story of one town's bravery. "Chris," Vanessa said one day during a board meeting, "we need you to be the face of this. Your voice can take this message farther than we ever imagined. Chris hesitated. I'm just a guy who stood up when it mattered. This isn't about me, it's about all of us. Vanessa smiled. Exactly. And that's why people will listen to you. A national movement. Chris agreed, and soon he was traveling across the country, speaking at schools, community centers, and even national forums. His message was simple: courage isn't the absence of fear, it's standing up in spite of it. The Fearless Fund grew into a national movement, with chapters in cities across the country. Each chapter worked to create safe spaces, provide resources for victims, and promote education about standing up to bullying and violence. At one rally, Chris addressed a crowd of thousands. When I stood up to the steel wolves, I wasn't fearless, I was terrified. But I knew that if I didn't act, things would never change. That's what courage is, acting even when you're scared. And together, we're proving that fear doesn't have to win. Unfinished business. Despite the overwhelming success of the movement, Chris knew the fight wasn't over. Reaper's warning lingered in the back of his mind. The Steel Wolves were part of a larger network, and their fall had undoubtedly upset powerful people. One evening, as Chris sat in his studio reviewing tracks for his next album, Officer Thompson called. We've got intel that some of Reaper's connections are regrouping. They're not happy about what's happened. Chris sighed. What's their angle? They're trying to re-establish control in nearby towns, Thompson said. We're keeping an eye on things, but they're not going to go quietly. Chris nodded. Let me know how I can help. The album that changed everything. Amid the ongoing challenges, Chris poured his energy into his music. His next album, titled Fearless, was a raw, emotional exploration of courage, unity, and standing up to adversity. Tracks like Rise Together and No Chains became anthems for the movement, resonating with people far beyond the town's borders. The album broke records, topping charts and earning critical acclaim. But for Chris, the real victory was seeing how his music inspired others. Videos of people standing up to bullies, organizing community events, and rebuilding their neighborhoods flooded social media, all set to the soundtrack of his album. A quiet evening. One night, after a particularly long day of meetings and events, Chris found himself back at the bar where it all began. The neon lights of Snoop's Groove Bar cast their familiar glow as Chris took his usual seat at the counter. Vanessa approached with a knowing smile. Feels like a lifetime ago, doesn't it? Chris nodded. It does. But some things haven't changed. Vanessa placed a glass of iced tea in front of him. Like your order? Chris chuckled. Like the fact that this place still feels like home. As they sat in companionable silence, the bar door opened, and a group of young people walked in. They hesitated for a moment, clearly in awe of Chris, before approaching him. Mr. Evans, one of them said nervously, we just wanted to say thank you. Your story gave us the courage to stand up to a gang in our neighborhood. We're starting our own community group now. Chris smiled warmly. You don't need to thank me. You're the ones who made the choice to stand up. That takes real courage. The group left, their excitement palpable. Vanessa watched them go, her eyes shining with pride. You've changed so many lives, Chris. Chris shook his head. We've changed lives, Vanessa. None of this would have happened without all of us working together. Looking ahead. As Chris left the bar that night, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The battle against fear and intimidation was far from over, but the town had proven that unity and courage could overcome even the darkest challenges. Walking into the quiet streets, Chris looked up at the stars, a small smile playing on his lips. The road ahead was uncertain, but he was ready for whatever came next. Because he knew one thing for sure. When people stood together, fear didn't stand a chance. Part 8. The Gathering Storm. Chris woke up to a new day with the kind of clarity and purpose that only came after hard-fought battles. But the feeling was short-lived. His phone buzzed with an urgent message from Officer Thompson. We have credible intel. A larger faction of the Steel Wolves network is mobilizing. They've been quiet since Reaper's arrest, but something's brewing. Stay alert. Chris leaned back in his chair, reading the message over and over. He knew this wasn't the end, but the thought of another confrontation loomed heavy. The movement they'd built, the courage they'd inspired, Could it withstand another test? Rising tensions. That evening, Vanessa arrived at the studio looking unusually tense. She handed Chris a folder filled with photographs and reports. "This is everything the police have gathered. These aren't just local gangs anymore, Chris. They're pulling in resources from chapters across the region." Chris flipped through the documents. The images showed groups of bikers in different towns, organizing rallies and intimidating businesses. "They're trying to rebuild their reputation," Vanessa said. "To prove that what happened here was a fluke." Chris closed the folder, determination hardening his features. "Then we remind them that what happened here wasn't a fluke, it was the start of something they can't stop. The plan for resistance." Chris called a meeting with community leaders, law enforcement, and members of the Fearless Fund. The room buzzed with a mix of fear and determination as they discussed the growing threat. "We can't let them intimidate us into silence," Chris said, standing at the front of the room. "But we also can't underestimate them. This time, they're better organized, more coordinated." Officer Thompson nodded. "We've requested reinforcements from state and federal agencies, but it's going to take time. In the meantime, we need to be vigilant." Vanessa stood up. "We've been working on expanding the Fearless Fund's support network. We'll focus on providing resources for people in the affected areas. Legal aid, security measures, trauma counseling, whatever it takes to help them stand strong." Chris smiled at her. "That's exactly what we need. We can't fight this battle alone. It's going to take all of us working together." The counter-movement. As the Steel Wolves network ramped up their efforts, the Fearless Fund did the same. Community centers became hubs of activity, organizing self-defense workshops, town hall meetings, and fundraising events. Social media lit up with stories of resistance, with people from all walks of life sharing how they were standing up to fear. Chris and Vanessa toured nearby towns, meeting with community leaders and speaking at events. Every time they stepped on stage, the message was the same: fear doesn't win unless we let it. But the tension was palpable. Every speech, every event carried the risk of retaliation. Security was tightened, but Chris refused to let fear dictate his actions. The Wolves' retaliation. One night, while Chris and his team were in a neighboring town, word came that several businesses in their own community had been vandalized. Windows were shattered, vehicles spray-painted with threatening messages, and property destroyed. Chris returned to find Snoop's Groove Bar among the targets. Joe stood outside, surveying the damage with a grim expression. "They're trying to send a message," Joe said. "But they don't realize, this place is more than just walls and windows. It's a symbol." Chris placed a hand on Joe's shoulder. "And symbols don't break that easily." The final confrontation. As the weeks went on, it became clear that the Steel Wolves network was planning something big. Rumors circulated of a massive rally in a nearby city, a show of force meant to re-establish their dominance. Chris and his team decided to act. They worked with law enforcement and local activists to organize a counter-event, the Unity Rally. It would be a celebration of resilience and courage, held on the same day as the Steel Wolves Rally. The Unity Rally drew thousands. Families, students, activists, and even former victims of the Steel Wolves came together to show that fear could be defeated. Chris took the stage, his voice steady and powerful as he addressed the crowd. "This isn't just about standing up to one gang. This is about standing up to the idea that fear can control us. It's about proving that when we come together, we're stronger than any threat." A new era. The Steel Wolves Rally, meanwhile, was a shadow of what they had planned. The overwhelming turnout at the Unity Rally stole their momentum, and internal divisions began to surface. Law enforcement, bolstered by new evidence and witnesses, launched a coordinated crackdown on the gang's operations. In the aftermath, Chris and his team focused on rebuilding. The Fearless Fund expanded its reach, and new chapters were established across the country. What had started as one man standing up in a bar had grown into a national movement, changing lives and inspiring communities. Epilogue. The Legacy. Years later, Chris stood outside Snoop's Groove Bar, now a historic landmark and community center. Vanessa walked up beside him, holding a flyer for the annual Unity Festival. "Hard to believe how far we've come," she said. Chris nodded. "But we're not done yet. There's always more to do. As they watched families gather for the festival, Chris felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The fight against fear would never truly end, but he knew one thing for certain. Together, they had proven that courage was contagious, and that when people stood united, no force could break them. Continue. ChatGPT said. ChatGPT. Part 9. Building the Future. The Unity Festival became a tradition in their town, a yearly celebration of resilience and community spirit. It wasn't just a reminder of the past, it was a beacon of hope for the future. Every year, new faces joined the crowd, drawn by the story of how ordinary people had stood up to extraordinary challenges. Chris remained at the heart of the movement, but he had learned to share the leadership. Vanessa, with her unyielding determination, became the director of the Fearless Fund, expanding its operations to cities across the country. Joe transformed Snoop's Groove Bar into a community hub, hosting workshops, art exhibits, and open mic nights where people shared their stories of overcoming fear. Spreading the message. As the movement grew, Chris found himself in demand far beyond his small town. Universities invited him to speak about leadership and resilience, while nonprofits sought his advice on empowering communities. He partnered with schools to create programs that taught young people about standing up to bullying and intimidation. One of the most impactful initiatives was the Youth Leaders Program, which provided mentorship and resources for young people from underserved communities. Chris personally mentored many of the participants, teaching them not only about leadership but also about the importance of empathy and understanding. A new challenge. But just as things seemed to stabilize, a new challenge arose. A shadowy organization, calling itself the Iron Fangs, began filling the void left by the Steel Wolves. Unlike the Steel Wolves, the Iron Fangs operated with more sophistication, focusing on cyber intimidation, extortion through digital means, and coordinated online harassment campaigns. Chris and his team realized that the fight against fear was evolving. They adapted by forming partnerships with tech experts, law enforcement, and cybersecurity firms. Together, they launched Project Shield, a nationwide initiative to combat digital intimidation and protect vulnerable communities from online threats. Fear doesn't just live in the streets anymore, Chris said during the project's launch event. It's in our homes, on our screens. But just like we stood up to it before, we'll stand up to it again. Personal growth. Amid the challenges, Chris found moments of personal growth. He reconnected with old friends, made new ones, and even found love in an unexpected place. Vanessa, his longtime ally, had always been his strongest supporter. Over time, their friendship deepened into something more. "You've always been my partner in this," Chris told her one quiet evening after the Unity Festival. "I can't imagine doing any of it without you." Vanessa smiled. "Good, because I'm not going anywhere." Their relationship became another pillar of strength for the movement, showing that even in the face of darkness, there was room for love and connection. Global impact. The movement's influence began to spread beyond the United States. Activists from other countries reached out, inspired by the story of how one town had stood up to fear. Chris and Vanessa traveled internationally, sharing their experiences and learning from others. In a small village in Eastern Europe, they met a group of young activists who had started their own version of the Fearless Fund. In South America, they visited a community that had successfully ousted a local gang using strategies inspired by Chris's teachings. "It's not just about one fight or one place," Chris told a gathering of activists in Asia. "It's about creating a culture where fear has no power, where people stand together and refuse to let intimidation win." The ripple effect. Back in their town, the effects of their efforts were visible everywhere. Crime rates had dropped, businesses thrived, and the community grew closer. The bar that had once been a target was now a symbol of unity, its walls adorned with murals depicting the movement's journey. But Chris knew the work was never truly done. He continued to mentor new leaders, ensuring that the movement's values would live on even after he stepped back. "It's not about me," he often said. "It's about all of us." A legacy of courage. Years later, Chris and Vanessa sat on a bench overlooking the town square, where children played and families gathered. The Unity Festival was in full swing, and the energy was infectious. A young boy approached them, holding a notebook and looking nervous. "Are you Mr. Chris?" he asked. "The one who stood up to the bikers?" Chris smiled warmly. "That's me. What's your name?" The boy introduced himself and explained that he was writing a school paper about courage. "Do you think I could ever do something brave like you did?" Chris leaned forward, meeting the boy's eyes. "You already have courage, kid. It's in every choice you make to do the right thing, even when it's hard. Just remember, courage isn't about being fearless. It's about standing up even when you're scared." The boy beamed, and Chris watched him run back to his friends. As Vanessa squeezed his hand, Chris felt a deep sense of peace. They had faced darkness, but they had also built something that would shine for generations to come. The fight against fear would never truly end, but Chris knew one thing for certain. Together, they had created a world where courage could thrive, and where people believed that standing up for what was right could change everything. The next chapter, Courage Never Ends. As the years rolled by, Chris's story became more than just a local legend. It became a symbol of how resilience and unity could triumph over fear and division. The town, once threatened by intimidation, had transformed into a beacon of hope, attracting visitors and activists from all over the world who wanted to learn from its remarkable journey. The Fearless Institute. One of the most impactful outcomes of the movement was the establishment of the Fearless Institute, a global center for leadership and community empowerment. Built in the heart of the town, the institute was housed in a state-of-the-art facility that combined traditional learning spaces with advanced technology labs. The institute offered programs in conflict resolution, leadership development, cybersecurity, and community organizing. Chris served as its honorary founder, though he insisted the real credit belonged to the people who had stood by him from the beginning. Vanessa became the institute's first director, overseeing a team of educators, researchers, and community leaders who shared their knowledge with students from around the world. "Fearless isn't just a word," Vanessa said during the institute's opening ceremony. "It's a way of life. It's about standing up, reaching out, and never giving up, no matter how tough the fight." Raising new leaders. The institute quickly became a hub for young people eager to make a difference. Students from diverse backgrounds brought their stories, challenges, and ideas, creating a melting pot of innovation and inspiration. Chris personally mentored many of them, often telling them, "Leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about listening, understanding, and finding solutions that lift everyone up." One such student, Maya, came from a neighborhood struggling with gang violence. Inspired by Chris's story, she started a grassroots campaign to reclaim her streets, eventually founding a program that helped at-risk youth find jobs and opportunities instead of falling into gang culture. "Your story gave me the courage to try," she told Chris during her graduation speech. "And now, it's my turn to pass that courage on." The unfinished fight. While the Fearless Institute thrived, challenges remained. The remnants of groups like the Steel Wolves and the Iron Fangs lingered, trying to adapt and regain influence. But with every attempt to intimidate or disrupt, they found themselves facing communities that had grown stronger and more united. Chris continued to monitor these developments, often working behind the scenes with law enforcement and community leaders to preempt new threats. His experience in navigating high-pressure situations made him an invaluable strategist. "Fear evolves," Chris often said. "But so does courage. As long as we keep learning and adapting, we'll always be one step ahead." A personal milestone. Amidst all the work, Chris and Vanessa reached a new milestone in their personal lives. Surrounded by friends and family, they got married in a heartfelt ceremony at the town square, the very place where the community had first united against fear. The wedding was as much a celebration of love as it was of resilience. People from all walks of life attended, from former bar patrons to international activists. It was a testament to how far they had come and how many lives they had touched along the way. During his vows, Chris looked out at the crowd and said, "Every victory we've achieved, every challenge we've faced, it all comes down to one thing: the people who stand beside us. Vanessa, you've been my strength, my partner, and my light. Together, there's nothing we can't overcome." A legacy of hope. As Chris and Vanessa started their family, They made sure their children grew up understanding the values that had shaped their lives. Their eldest, Lily, showed an early interest in community work, often accompanying her parents to events and volunteering at the institute. "Do you think I can be fearless like you, Dad?" she once asked. Chris smiled. "You don't have to be fearless, Lily. You just have to be brave enough to try." The global movement. Over time, the Fearless Institute expanded its reach, establishing satellite centers in cities around the world. The ripple effect of Chris's story continued to inspire movements for justice, equality, and empowerment. In one particularly moving moment, Chris received a video message from a small village in Africa where the institute had funded a new school. The children, dressed in colorful uniforms, held signs that read, "Thank you for teaching us to be brave." Looking ahead, as Chris and Vanessa sat together one quiet evening, watching the sun set over their town, they reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The fight against fear had been long and arduous, but it had also been deeply rewarding. "Do you think we've done enough?" Vanessa asked softly. Chris took her hand and smiled. "We've done what we could, and that's all anyone can do. The rest is up to the people we've inspired, the seeds we've planted. And I have a feeling they'll do just fine." The future was uncertain, as it always was. But Chris and Vanessa knew one thing for sure. The world was a little braver, a little stronger, and a little kinder because they had chosen to stand up and fight. And as long as courage existed in even one person's heart, the fight against fear would never truly be over. The next generation. As the years passed, Chris and Vanessa's work inspired an entire generation of leaders, activists, and changemakers. The Fearless Institute became a symbol of hope and resilience globally, attracting attention from governments, NGOs, and international organizations seeking guidance on how to empower communities in the face of adversity. Chris and Vanessa's daughter, Lily, emerged as a rising star within the movement. By the time she reached her early 20s, Lily had already traveled to over a dozen countries, sharing stories of courage and unity. Following in her father's footsteps, she developed a knack for storytelling that moved audiences to action. During a speech at the United Nations, Lily shared her family's philosophy: "Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to act in spite of it. My parents taught me that even the smallest act of bravery can spark a fire that lights up the world." Her words echoed across the assembly hall, a poignant reminder of how far one story could reach. A new threat. While the Fearless Institute thrived, challenges never ceased. A new gang, calling themselves the Shadowfangs, began to surface in major cities, employing more sophisticated tactics than the Steel Wolves ever had. They operated in the digital realm, spreading fear and misinformation through social media and cyber attacks. Chris, ever vigilant, recognized the danger. "This isn't just about physical intimidation anymore," he told his team during a strategy meeting. "This is about controlling narratives, manipulating fear on a global scale." The Fearless Institute responded by creating a specialized division focused on cybersecurity and digital empowerment. This team worked to educate communities on how to recognize and combat online threats, while also collaborating with tech companies to dismantle harmful networks. Vanessa played a key role in this effort, leveraging her background in community work to develop workshops that taught people how to stay safe and informed in the digital age. The ultimate stand. The Shadowfangs, however, weren't content to stay in the shadows. They attempted to strike directly at the Fearless Institute, hacking into its systems and threatening to release sensitive data about its members and operations. Chris called an emergency meeting. "If we back down now, everything we've worked for will be undone," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "We need to show them that fear, whether physical or digital, will never have the final say." The team worked tirelessly to counter the attack, enlisting the help of tech experts and ethical hackers from around the world. Lily, now a leader in her own right, spearheaded a social media campaign to rally public support. Using the hashtag #FearlessTogether, people from all walks of life shared their stories of resilience and unity, flooding the internet with messages of hope and defiance. Within days, the Shadowfangs' efforts were drowned out by a global wave of positivity and solidarity. Realizing their tactics had backfired, the Shadowfangs retreated, their influence diminished. The Fearless Institute, once again, stood as a beacon of courage in a world that often felt dark and uncertain. A legacy cemented. Years later, as Chris sat on the porch of his home, now a grandfather, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The world was far from perfect, but it was undeniably better than the one he had first stood up to fight against. Lily had taken over much of the leadership at the Fearless Institute, while Vanessa continued to mentor young leaders from around the world. Their family had grown, not just in numbers but in influence, with each member playing a role in carrying forward the values of courage, unity, and resilience. One evening, as the sun set over the town that had become a global symbol of hope, Chris turned to Vanessa and said, "We didn't just change this town. We changed the world." Vanessa smiled, resting her hand on his. And it all started with one decision: to not let fear win. The end of the beginning. The Fearless Institute continued to grow, its reach extending to every corner of the globe. Chris and Vanessa's story became a lesson taught in schools, a documentary streamed in millions of homes, and a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one person's courage could ignite a movement. And though Chris eventually stepped away from the spotlight, his legacy remained a guiding light for generations to come, a testament to the power of standing up, speaking out, and believing that fear would never have the final word. A global movement. The Fearless Institute's mission extended far beyond its humble beginnings. With Lily at the helm, the organization evolved into a global movement. Leaders, activists, and changemakers from over 50 countries collaborated under its banner, spreading its principles of courage, community, and resilience. Annual summits brought together world leaders, innovators, and everyday heroes to discuss pressing issues, from climate change to social justice. These events were more than conferences; they were celebrations of humanity's collective strength. Lily launched programs tailored to specific challenges. For example, Courage in the Classroom, aimed at empowering students to stand up against bullying, fostering environments of mutual respect. Fearless Cities Initiative, partnering with local governments to create safer, more inclusive urban spaces. Digital Defense Academy, teaching communities to combat cyberbullying, misinformation, and online harassment. These initiatives turned the Fearless Institute into more than just an organization. It became a way of life. Chris and Vanessa's continued role. While Lily was now the face of the movement, Chris and Vanessa remained integral to its heart. They became mentors, guiding leaders who were navigating their own battles against fear and oppression. Their wisdom, earned through decades of struggle and triumph, inspired countless others. One evening, Chris was invited to give a speech at an international summit in Geneva. His voice, though softened with age, carried the same conviction it had all those years ago. "The greatest weapon against fear," he said, "is unity. When we come together, when we see each other not as enemies but as allies, there is no force that can break us." Courage isn't found in grand gestures. It's found in the quiet determination to do what's right, no matter the cost. The audience gave him a standing ovation. Vanessa, sitting in the front row, wiped a tear from her eye. She knew Chris's words would echo across the world, just as they had so many times before. The Shadow Fangs resurface. Despite their success, threats remained. The Shadow Fangs, though weakened, began to re-emerge under new leadership. This time, their tactics were more insidious, targeting not just communities but the Fearless Institute itself. Lily and her team uncovered a plot to discredit the organization. Fake news stories and doctored videos began circulating, claiming the institute was corrupt and exploitative. While these lies didn't fool those who knew the truth, they sowed seeds of doubt in others. Chris, Vanessa, and Lily convened an emergency meeting. It was clear that this was more than just a smear campaign. It was a battle for the soul of the movement. "We faced worse," Chris said. "This is just another test. The truth always wins in the end." Lily proposed a bold counter-strategy: transparency. The institute opened its doors to journalists, allowing them to document every aspect of its operations. They hosted live Q&A sessions, where community members could ask anything and receive honest answers. This approach turned the tide. The truth, amplified by the institute's unwavering commitment to its mission, overshadowed the lies. Public support surged, and the Shadow Fangs found themselves once again outmatched. The future beckons. As the years went on, the Fearless Institute continued to evolve. Technology became a cornerstone of its efforts, with virtual reality simulations teaching people how to respond to fear and adversity. Artificial intelligence helped identify and counteract threats before they could take hold. Chris and Vanessa, now in their twilight years, watched with pride as Lily led the Institute into a new era. Their family had grown in more ways than one, with countless people across the globe considering themselves part of the Fearless legacy. One evening, as Chris sat on the porch with Vanessa, they reflected on their journey. "Do you think they'll remember us?" Vanessa asked softly. Chris smiled. "They won't need to. They'll remember what we stood for. And that's enough." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in golden light, it was clear that their work had not only changed their community but had left an indelible mark on the world. The Fearless Institute was no longer just an organization. It was a promise. A promise that no matter how dark the world might seem, there would always be light as long as people had the courage to stand together. And that promise would endure for generations to come. Ripples of change. The victory at Snoop's Groove Bar didn't just echo through the town. It spread far beyond. News outlets picked up the story, highlighting the bravery of the community standing up against fear. Social media was ablaze with hashtags like #UnityOverFear and #StandWithSnoop. Videos of the final showdown went viral, inspiring others to take action in their own towns. Snoop sat with Vanessa and Mike in the bar, which had quickly transformed into a community hub. The once dim lights seemed to shine brighter now, reflecting the hope and determination of those gathered. "People are talking about what we did here," Vanessa said, scrolling through her phone. "Other towns are organizing meetings, forming coalitions to push back against intimidation." Mike leaned back in his chair, a rare look of pride on his face. "This isn't just a victory for us, it's a blueprint for others." Snoop nodded, his gaze steady. "Change starts small, but it grows. If we've shown anything, it's that unity is the real power." A new challenge. But not all the reactions were positive. Reaper's network, still active in other regions, wasn't about to let their defeat go unanswered. Reports of retaliation surfaced, with smaller gangs trying to fill the void left by the Steel Wolves. "We can't let our guard down," Mike warned during a community meeting. "They might regroup, and when they do, they'll come back harder." Snoop leaned forward, his hands clasped. "Then we keep building. Strengthen our ties, support other communities, and make sure they know they're not alone." Vanessa looked around at the group, her resolve clear. "We've already proven what we can do. If they come back, they'll find a town stronger than ever." Legacy of hope. Weeks turned into months, and the town flourished in the aftermath of their victory. New initiatives were launched, community programs, youth centers, and support groups, all aimed at fostering unity and resilience. Snoop's Groove Bar became a symbol of hope, its walls adorned with photographs and messages of gratitude from people across the country. One evening, as Snoop prepared for another performance at the bar, Joe approached him with a framed photo. It was a picture of the community standing together outside the bar on the night of the showdown, their faces lit with courage and determination. "We couldn't have done this without you," Joe said, his voice thick with emotion. Snoop smiled, placing a hand on Joe's shoulder. "You didn't need me, Joe. You just needed each other." As the bar filled with laughter and music, Snoop looked around, his heart full. The fight wasn't over, but they had proven that fear could be beaten, not with fists, but with unity. And that, he knew, was a legacy worth fighting for. The ripple effect. The story of the small-town victory spread far and wide. News outlets picked up the narrative, highlighting how a rapper-turned-community leader and a determined town stood up against fear. Social media platforms buzzed with clips and stories from the night, and #StandWithSnoop became a trending hashtag. In nearby towns, similar communities began organizing. Inspired by the courage displayed at Snoop's Groove Bar, people who had long been silenced by fear began speaking out. Local leaders from other areas reached out to Snoop, asking for advice and offering support. Inside the bar, Joe set down the latest newspaper on the counter. The headline read, A town stands tall, unity defeats fear. He looked at Snoop, pride shining in his eyes. You've started something, Snoop? Snoop, sipping his tea, smiled faintly. It's not me. It's us. Every person who stood up, who refused to back down. That's who made this happen. Vanessa, scrolling through her phone, chimed in. There are talks of forming a regional coalition. Towns working together to push back against intimidation. Can you believe that? Snoop set his tea down, his voice steady. I can. When people realize they're not alone, that's when real change happens. A lingering threat. But not everyone celebrated the victory. The remnants of the Steel Wolves regrouped in neighboring territories. Though their leader, Reaper, had been humiliated, he wasn't one to fade quietly into the background. Reports of smaller, fragmented gangs trying to reclaim control began to surface. Mike, ever vigilant, updated Snoop during one of their late-night meetings. We've been hearing chatter. They're trying to rebuild. Reaper's still out there, and he's angry. Snoop nodded, his expression serious. Let him be angry. Fear doesn't work here anymore. But we'll stay ready. Vanessa, seated nearby, added, and this time, we've got more than just our town. Other communities are standing with us now, building a legacy. With the immediate threat behind them, the town shifted its focus to building something lasting. Community programs were launched, focusing on education, youth mentorship, and small business support. The bar, once a symbol of intimidation, transformed into a community center by day while retaining its lively atmosphere at night. One evening, as the bar buzzed with activity, a group of teenagers approached Snoop. They had been inspired by his leadership and wanted advice on how to start their own initiatives. Remember, Snoop told them, it's not about being the loudest voice. It's about listening, understanding, and standing together. That's how you make real change. The teenagers nodded, their faces lit with determination. A message to Reaper. Despite the town's progress, Snoop knew Reaper wasn't done. One night he received a letter, a direct message from the Steel Wolves' former leader. It read, "You may have won the battle, but the war isn't over." Snoop folded the letter, placing it on the counter. Vanessa, reading over his shoulder, frowned. "What are you going to do?" Snoop smiled, his calm demeanor unshaken. "The same thing we've been doing. Keep building, keep uniting, and keep showing them that fear has no place here." Vanessa raised her glass. "To the future." Snoop raised his tea in return. "To the future." The bar erupted in cheers, a powerful reminder that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Rebuilding trust. With the Steel Wolves gone, the town began the slow process of healing. Community leaders met at Snoop's Groove Bar, now a symbol of resistance, to discuss rebuilding efforts and addressing the fear that had once gripped their town. Joe stood behind the bar, serving coffee and snacks to the group. "We've made it through the worst," he said, his voice steady. "But now we need to make sure this never happens again." Snoop nodded, looking at the diverse group of people around him. "This is our chance to rebuild, not just the town, but the trust we've lost over the years. Fear divided us, but unity brought us back. Let's make sure we hold on to that." Mike stepped forward with a clipboard in hand. "We've set up a neighborhood watch program, and the police are committed to working more closely with the community. But we'll need volunteers to keep it running." Hands shot up across the room, people eager to contribute. Vanessa, still sporting her battle-earned bruise, stood tall. "I'll organize a roster," she offered. "We're not going back to the way things were." Spreading the message. The story of the town's triumph spread far and wide. News channels featured interviews with Snoop, Mike, and Vanessa, showcasing how unity could overcome even the most intimidating of threats. Social media erupted with hashtags like #StandWithSnoop and #FearEndsHere, turning the small town into a national symbol of resilience. One evening, Snoop found himself on a live-streamed panel with leaders from neighboring towns. "What's your advice for communities facing similar challenges?" a reporter asked. Snoop leaned forward, his voice steady. "It starts with standing together. Bullies thrive on isolation. When we come together, we're stronger than anything fear can throw at us." The panel ended with a standing ovation, the impact of their story rippling across the nation. a lingering threat. Though the steel wolves had been defeated, Snoop knew the fight wasn't over. Mike approached him one evening, his expression serious. "We've been monitoring chatter from some of the steel wolves' former allies. There's talk of retaliation." Snoop sipped his tea, his face calm but determined. "Let them try. We've shown them that this town won't back down. And if they come, we'll stand together again." Vanessa, overhearing the conversation, added, "They underestimated us before. They won't make that mistake twice, but neither will we." Building a legacy. The town's victory became a turning point, inspiring others to stand against oppression. Snoop's Groove Bar transformed into a hub for community initiatives, hosting workshops on leadership, conflict resolution, and self-defense. The bar's walls, once adorned with music posters, now showcased photos from the night the town stood together. Joe, now a local hero in his own right, reflected on the changes. This bar was just a place to grab a drink. Now, it's where people come to make a difference? Snoop smiled, raising his glass. To the future. Vanessa and Mike joined in, their glasses clinking together. To unity, they echoed. As the bar filled with laughter and conversation, it was clear that the town's story wasn't just about one victory. It was about a community that refused to let fear define them, a legacy that would endure for generations. Rising from the ashes. With the steel wolves defeated and their leader, Reaper, humiliated, the town began to rebuild its sense of security. Snoop's Groove Bar became more than just a gathering place. It became the heart of the community. People who had once stayed silent out of fear were now stepping forward to share their stories, their voices stronger than ever. Joe, wiping down the counter, looked up as Snoop walked in. "You've turned this place into something I never thought it could be, Snoop," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "This bar isn't just a bar anymore. It's a symbol." Snoop smiled faintly and looked around. "It's not about the place, Joe. It's about the people. They've found their courage, and now it's our job to keep that alive." Vanessa entered, carrying a stack of flyers. "Community meeting tonight," she announced. "We're planning a town-wide event to celebrate and to make sure everyone knows the Steel Wolves won't be coming back." Snoop nodded. "Good. This is just the beginning. If we want this change to last, we've got to stay united." The ripple effect. The story of the town's triumph spread far beyond its borders. News outlets picked up the story, dubbing it "The Day Fear Died." Videos from the bar went viral, showing the moment the Steel Wolves realized they were outmatched, not by violence, but by the strength of a united community. Other towns began reaching out, inspired by what they had seen. Community leaders from across the state wanted to learn from Snoop and his team, eager to replicate their success. One evening, Snoop sat on a live-streamed panel with leaders from neighboring towns. "How did you do it?" a moderator asked. "How did you turn fear into unity?" Snoop leaned forward, his voice calm and steady. "It wasn't me. It was the people. They realized that fear only works if you let it. Once we stood together, there was nothing they could do to break us." The panel ended with a standing ovation, and Snoop's message continued to resonate across the country. A warning from the shadows. Despite the victory, Snoop knew the fight wasn't over. Late one night, Mike showed up at the bar with a grim expression. "We've been hearing rumors," he said. "Reaper's connections run deeper than we thought. Some of the other chapters aren't happy about what happened here." Snoop nodded, his face unreadable. "Let them come. They'll find out what happens when people refuse to back down." Vanessa, overhearing the conversation, stepped forward. "We're not going back to the way things were. Whatever they try, we'll face it together." Mike hesitated. "Just be careful, Snoop. They won't play fair." "I never expected them to," Snoop replied. "But we've shown them that this town isn't afraid anymore. That's something they can't take away." Building a legacy. The bar's transformation into a hub of community action continued. Workshops on leadership, conflict resolution, and self-defense were held regularly, drawing people from all walks of life. The walls were adorned with photos from the night of the confrontation, serving as a reminder of what the town had overcome. One evening, Snoop stood before a packed room, addressing the crowd. "This isn't just about what happened here," he said. "It's about what's possible when people stand up for what's right. We've shown that fear doesn't have to win. As the town celebrated its newfound strength, the shadow of the steel wolves still loomed. Reaper, though defeated, wasn't finished. Rumors of a larger retaliation began to circulate, and Snoop knew they had to be ready. One evening he received an anonymous text, "You've made powerful enemies. Watch your back." Snoop stared at the message for a moment before deleting it. He turned to Vanessa and Mike, who were seated nearby. "They're not done," he said. "But neither are we." Vanessa nodded. "We've come too far to back down now." Mike placed a hand on Snoop's shoulder. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Snoop looked around the bar, now filled with laughter and conversation, and felt a deep sense of pride. The fight wasn't over, but they had already won something far more important, the courage to stand united no matter what came next. The ripple effect. The story of the town's victory over the steel wolves spread far and wide. Videos of the confrontation at Snoop's Groove Bar went viral, showing how a united community had defeated fear and intimidation. News outlets picked up the story, hailing it as a testament to the power of courage and unity. Neighboring towns began reaching out, inspired by the resilience they had witnessed. Community leaders sought advice from Snoop and his team on how to create similar movements in their areas. The bar transformed into more than just a symbol of victory. It became a hub for change. One evening, Snoop stood before a packed room of community leaders from surrounding towns. "This isn't just about standing up to bullies," he said. "It's about creating a culture where fear has no place, where people support each other, and where unity becomes our greatest strength." The shadows persist. Despite the victory, the remnants of the steel wolves were still out there. Reaper's network extended far beyond the local chapter, and rumors of retaliation began to circulate. Mike Thompson brought the latest intel to Snoop. "Reaper's been reaching out to other chapters," Mike said, his tone serious. "They're not happy about what happened here. They see it as a challenge to their power." Snoop remained calm. "Let them come. They'll find out that fear doesn't work here anymore." Vanessa, who had become a pillar of strength for the community, joined the conversation. "We've come too far to back down now. If they want to test us, they'll see just how strong we've become." The town began preparing for the possibility of another confrontation, this time with even greater resolve. Security measures were heightened, and community members continued to stand united, building a legacy. As the weeks passed, the town continued to heal and grow stronger. Workshops on leadership, self-defense, and community building were held at the bar, drawing people from all walks of life. Snoop's Groove Bar had become a symbol of hope and resilience. Joe, the bar owner, looked around one evening as the place buzzed with activity. "Who would have thought this little bar would become the heart of the town?" he said to Vanessa. "It's not the bar, Joe," Vanessa replied with a smile. "It's the people. They've found their strength, and that's something no one can take away." Snoop, overhearing their conversation, nodded in agreement. "This is just the beginning. If we want this change to last, we have to keep building on what we've started." A warning from Reaper. Late one night, Snoop received an anonymous message on his phone. "You've made powerful enemies. Watch your back." He stared at the message for a moment before showing it to Mike. "They're not done," Snoop said. "But neither are we." Mike sighed. "These people don't play fair, Snoop. You know that, right?" "I know," Snoop replied. "But we've already shown them that fear doesn't work here. If they come back, they'll find out just how united we are." Vanessa joined them, her determination unwavering. "We're ready for whatever comes next. This isn't just rebuilding with purpose." With the steel wolves vanquished and the town reclaiming its sense of security, Snoop's Groove Bar transformed into more than a bar. It became a symbol of resilience and a community hub. Meetings were held weekly to discuss the town's growth, and workshops on self-defense, leadership, and community building became regular events. Joe, the bar's owner, proudly observed the transformation. "This place isn't just mine anymore," he said to Snoop one evening. "It belongs to the people." Snoop smiled, nodding. "It always did, Joe. We just needed to show them how strong they could be." Vanessa spearheaded a new initiative, organizing support groups for victims of past intimidation. "Healing takes time," she told the attendees. But together, we can move forward. The community's efforts inspired neighboring towns to follow suit. Leaders from nearby areas began visiting, eager to learn how to replicate the success. Snoop welcomed them, offering advice drawn from his own experiences. This isn't about fighting back, he explained during one session. It's about standing firm, showing bullies that their tactics don't work when we're united. The return of shadows. Despite the overwhelming success, shadows lingered. Reaper's network had not been entirely dismantled, and whispers of retaliation began circulating. Mike, ever vigilant, brought the latest intelligence to Snoop. Reaper's trying to regroup, he warned. He's reaching out to other chapters, trying to rebuild his army. Snoop leaned back in his chair, considering the information. Let him try. We've already shown that their methods don't work anymore. Vanessa, sitting nearby, chimed in. We're not the same scared community we were before. They'll find that out if they try anything. Still, the town remained on high alert. Patrols were increased, and plans were made to protect the community in case of another attack. Snoop and his team knew they couldn't afford to be complacent. A message from Reaper. One night, Snoop received an encrypted message. You've made enemies in places you can't imagine. This isn't over. He showed the message to Mike, who frowned. They're trying to rattle you. Snoop's expression remained calm. It's not working. Vanessa, however, was concerned. They're not just going to go away, Snoop. They'll keep trying. I know, Snoop replied. But we'll be ready. The town continued to prepare, balancing their newfound hope with the reality of the lingering threat. Community members refused to let fear take hold again, standing firm in their resolve. A legacy of strength. Months passed, and the town flourished. The bar became a hub of activity, hosting events that brought people together and strengthened their bonds. Snoop continued to lead by example, showing that true power came from unity and compassion. One evening, as the bar filled with laughter and music, Joe approached Snoop with a smile. You've changed this town, Snoop? Snoop shook his head. We changed it, Joe. All of us. Together. Vanessa raised a glass, her voice ringing out over the crowd. To courage, unity, and never letting fear win. The room erupted in cheers, the sound echoing far beyond the bar's walls. The Steel Wolves' reign of terror was over, and the town had emerged stronger, united, and unbreakable. Though whispers of Reaper's plans continued, the community remained vigilant. They had proven that fear could be overcome and that unity was stronger than intimidation. Snoop's Groove Bar stood as a symbol of hope, a reminder that courage could spark change. And as the town moved forward, one thing became clear: they were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with the strength of their unity and the lessons they had learned together. Let me know if you'd like any additions or further refinements. Rebuilding with purpose. The days that followed the Steel Wolves' retreat were marked by transformation. Snoop's Groove Bar became more than a bar. It turned into a symbol of resilience, a hub where the community gathered to rebuild and strengthen its bonds. Workshops on self-defense, leadership, and civic engagement became regular occurrences, hosted by Snoop and others who had taken a stand. Joe, the bar owner, marveled at the change. I never thought this place would mean so much to so many people, he said, watching as locals filled the bar for another community meeting. Snoop smiled, leaning against the counter. It always did, Joe. It just needed a reason to shine. Vanessa led a new initiative for victims of past intimidation, creating a safe space where they could share their stories and heal. Healing doesn't happen overnight, she told a group of attendees one evening. But together, we can move forward. The success of the town's unity began to ripple outward. Leaders from nearby communities visited, seeking guidance on how to stand up to their own challenges. Snoop welcomed them with open arms, sharing lessons from their fight. It's not about fighting back, Snoop explained during a meeting with neighboring towns. It's about showing bullies that their fear tactics don't work when we're united. Shadows linger. Despite the victory, there was an undercurrent of caution. Reaper's network wasn't entirely dismantled, and whispers of retaliation grew louder. Mike, ever watchful, brought the latest news to Snoop. They're regrouping, Mike said, his tone serious. Reaper's reaching out to other chapters. He's trying to rebuild. Snoop remained composed. Let him try. We've already shown them what unity can do. Vanessa, though steadfast, voiced her concern. They won't give up easily, Snoop. People like Reaper don't know how to let go. We're not the same scared community they faced before, Snoop replied. We'll be ready. The town stayed vigilant. Patrols increased, and plans were made to protect the people. Fear might have lingered, but it no longer ruled. A message from Reaper. Late one night, Snoop received a cryptic message. You've made enemies in places you can't imagine. This isn't over. He showed it to Mike, who frowned. They're testing you, trying to rattle you. Snoop chuckled, shaking his head. It's not working. Vanessa, however, remained uneasy. They'll come back, Snoop. And when they do, they'll come harder. Then we'll meet them head-on, Snoop said calmly. And we'll remind them why they failed the first time. A legacy of strength. Months passed, and the town flourished. Businesses thrived, families felt safe, and the bar remained a beacon of hope. Community members who had once lived in fear now stood tall, their confidence restored. One evening, as the bar buzzed with laughter and conversation, Joe approached Snoop with a grin. You've done something incredible here, Snoop. Snoop shook his head. We did this, Joe. All of us. Vanessa raised her glass, her voice strong and unwavering. To courage, unity, and never letting fear win. The bar erupted in cheers, their joy and strength echoing far beyond the walls. Though the shadows of the steel wolves lingered, they no longer held the town in their grip. The people had found their power, and they weren't letting it go. The fight wasn't just a battle against a gang. It was a testament to what could be achieved when a community united against fear. Snoop's leadership and the town's courage inspired others far and wide, proving that even in the face of intimidation, resilience and unity could prevail. And as the town moved forward, one thing was clear: they were ready for whatever came next, standing together as one, stronger than ever.